Thank you very much for your very good afternoon to you. Well, UFC middleweight world champion Dricus du Plessis' coach, Morne Visser, has been quoted as saying they would like to fight as early as December again. Who his next opponent will be, however, announced by UFC founder Dana White. Du Plessis successfully defended his title in an African battle against Nigeria's Israel Adesanya yesterday morning. Ringside was MMA journalist Sias Du Plessis. Earlier, I spoke to him before he heads back to South Africa.
Well, there was tons of booing. It was quite strange because the energy was all about Israel Adesanya. There was a huge part of the crowd that were so behind him the whole time. And when Dricus came out, they were just boos, despite the fact that the World Cup winners of Sias Du Plessis and Eben Etzebeth walking him out. I mean, speaking to Sias and Eben afterwards, they said this is the most intense they've ever felt, even more intense than a Rugby World Cup final. I said, you're joking. They said, we thought we were hardcore. This guy is super hardcore. So, I mean, that goes to say, but the energy has been incredible. Perth started off sort of sleepy when I arrived on Monday, and then you could just feel the anticipation and excitement building. And it got to a point where everyone was just excited about the UFC, not necessarily just Dricus, but the UFC being in town. So the energy was incredible and a phenomenal event.
There also was that third round, which completely belonged to Adesanya. As a South African and, just explaining that kind of energy that was in the arena at the time, going into that fourth round, what were your thoughts?
I was nervous. I think, we were all sort of anticipating a striking match, which we got, but I think Dricus looked like he was starting to find a little bit more energy. Adesanya looked like he was slowing down. And Dricus actually said that after the fight, that he felt he could feel that those sort of dominant periods of Adesanya were coming to, they were sort of shortening, if I can put it that way. And when he got to the end of the third, he was like, okay, we need to do something now. And I think the fact that he just had a little bit more momentum going into that fourth, because who knows, like you say, 2-1 to Dricus or 2-1 to Adesanya, either way, it was on a knife edge. And I think Dricus was doing his best to avoid going to the judges like he did with Sean Strickland in Toronto earlier this year. Now, of course, he just has a way of steamrolling his way through opponents. And he's got this physical, it's almost like he powers through pain, or he powers through adversity. And he really just is a forward steam engine, if I can put it that way. And he just had too much power. And he certainly rocked Adesanya in that fourth round. And Adesanya sort of said he slipped, so he didn't quite know. But it looked like he was feeling the effects of that Dricus shot. And then obviously it all went to the ground and Dricus did his thing.
It was interesting because at the beginning of the fight, in the second round, there actually was a point where Dricus took him down, where you knew once they were on the ground, it was Dricus's playground, because that's where he's strongest and that's where he could use his physicality. But the way that Adesanya got out of it, one kind of thought, sure, is this game plan going to work of getting him to the ground?
Yeah, I mean, speaking to his coach, Morne Visser, afterwards, he said there's a lot to work on. And Dricus said, though, that the game plan went according to plan. Although it didn't look like it, he was in a position where he wanted to test Adesanya's striking. He says he's never been kicked so hard in his life before. He said Adesanya is one of the hardest kickers he's ever faced. But he knew when he had an opportunity to shoot and take it to the ground, that his wrestling and pure strength. I mean, Nick Dricus is walking around 95 kilograms. He weighed in at 84. You do the math. He's suddenly this enormous middleweight that's taking on Adesanya, who weighed in a pound under the weight he was supposed to be. So it just shows Dricus was always looking to find a way to get the fight to the ground and overpower Adesanya, but he's definitely taken a few shots. The kicks in particular, there's a little cut on the head also. So I think from that point of view, Dricus was always aiming to somehow make his way to the ground. But when Adesanya was so elusive, Adesanya also realized he can't afford to go down to the ground. And look what happened when eventually he did go to the ground and Dricus submitted him with a rear naked choke.
Have you ever seen combat sports dictating a socio-political narrative in the way that Adesanya and Du Plessis have, and then even the comments that came from Strickland directly after the fight?
You think of the big heavyweight boxing in the back of the days, it was always sort of, Muhammad Ali doing his thing, Mike Tyson, but it was never as intense, I think, as this one, especially with the African narrative, like who's more African. At the end of the day, Dricus in his press conference afterwards said, I'm still the only African champion who resides in Africa, breathes African air. So he says he's won this verbal jabs, if I can put it in that way. But I think it certainly divided a lot of people. I think a lot of people on social media still, either Dricus or Izzy. A lot of people still saying yes, but Dricus talking about farm murders and all these sort of things. At the end of the day, though, I would put money on it that there were so many people tuning in to watch this fight, regardless of race, religion, anything like that. It was all about Dricus, all about backing a South African against Israel Adesanya. And obviously, Nigeria was all behind Adesanya. But I think South Africa collectively were all rooting for Dricus to get the job done. And he's done it, and he's made history. And another reason to celebrate as South Africans.
I suppose the other reason that many South Africans were waiting to see whether Dricus would actually beat Israel Adesanya was because they're hoping that the UFC will come to South Africa.
It's an interesting one, and it's a great question because it's on the lips of everyone, even the American journalists, the Kiwi journalists, the Aussie journalists that were there. I mean, there was a good media turnout, and everyone was asking when it was going to happen. And according to what Dricus was saying, we had the sports minister, Gayton McKenzie here. He was, watching the fight. He's convinced it's happening next year. But the question is now, who does Du Plessis fight? Because Alex Pereira, who's the light heavyweight champion, is sort of into it, calling him out on social media. Sean Strickland has had a lot to say, and Dana White said that Sean Strickland deserves a title shot, or at least another title shot, whereas Dricus at the press conference said, if there's anyone who deserves a title shot, it's Robert Whittaker. So there's a lot to be decided. Also, does Dricus go up to light heavyweight? Does Alex Pereira come down to middleweight? The fact of the matter is that jigsaw will also determine who he fights, but it's definitely coming to South Africa. And I would say it won't probably be this year. With looking at the calendar for the UFC so far, they always have a grand event in New York towards the end of the year. But I would think that South Africa next year, definitely on the cards.
How does it work in the UFC as to who you do fight next? I mean, you've thrown out 3 different names. Dana White with who his favorite would be, the fighter himself, who his favorite will be, but it doesn't go according to who the fighter wants to fight. We've seen that many times in the past. So what is the actual formula then in UFC?
Well, I think at this point in time, Dricus will have some say. Just because he's won the belt, retained the belt. So he will have some say as to who he chooses to fight. Now it's a case of not who the UFC wants him to fight. It's kind of who he chooses to fight, although Dricus is game for anyone. So the UFC will have their rankings. They'll also look at who's on a fight streak, who's on a winning streak, who's in form at the moment, if I can put it that way. And then they will sort of make out who's available, who's not injured, and they'll have a look at it. So the matchmaker would have had a conversation with Dana. These guys have got a plan for 6 months. So they're already looking at who potentially. I know that Dricus is keen on anyone because he says, bring it to South Africa and try and stop me, which we all believe. But I think when the UFC decides who they want to, that will be known down the line. But it will generally be Dana making the announcement on social media. So to answer your question, there's a lot of factors that goes into it, but it's about rankings as well as who is the fighter best suited at that point in time. We'll put the bums on seats and we'll offer the biggest challenge to the reigning champion.
Can you tell us a little bit about Robert Whittaker and why he would be Dricus's first choice?
Robert Whittaker is a phenomenal UFC athlete. He's one of the most dominant UFC fighters in the middleweight division that there's ever been, I suppose, apart from Adesanya and now Dricus du Plessis. He's Australian. He is nicknamed the Reaper. He puts on a show every time. When he fought Dricus actually said, Whittaker is one of my heroes. When I looked across at the octagon and looked at Whittaker, I had to pinch myself because here's a guy whose poster I had on my wall, whose DVDs I had, and I was watching him. So he's a phenomenal athlete, a great human being. But he's been doing a lot of work for Fox Sports here in Australia. And speaking to one of the reporters or presenters yesterday, they said Whittaker's actually withdrawn from a lot of their media engagements to focus on preparing. And Whittaker's just come through a dominant victory. He's the guy that everyone wants to see because he puts on a show. So he's the type of guy that I think will provide Dricus with a stern challenge. But Dricus has beaten him and he's gone straight through him and made him look like an average fighter. And Robert Whittaker is nothing from, he's not average at all.
What is the longest winning streak in the UFC? And is that perhaps the next piece of history that Dricus would want to be chasing?
I'd be lying if I told you the exact number, but I can tell you that Dricus currently is on a 10-fight unbeaten run. He hasn't lost in 6 years. So he is up there. He's not near the top of the list. I'll have to check that stat and get back to you, but it's probably in the region of sort of between 14 and 18 fights. But at this point in time, Dricus is on a 10-fight tear. He's finished most of his opponents except for Strickland. You know, someone who hasn't lost in 6 years is full of confidence. He almost feels like he can't lose. And I think that confidence, that sort of big energy that he brings into the octagon was evident in having the box behind him and next to him. I mean, I don't know if you saw Sia and Irvin going absolutely mental when the result was called out. So Dricus at this point in time is very much the man to beat. And if he goes on and defends his title again, you know, then suddenly we start talking about the greatest middleweight in the history of the UFC. Suddenly he surpasses someone like Adesanya. But at this point in time, Dricus is enjoying an undefeated streak, and who knows what's next.